Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford, along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Today I am chatting with Nick Hart, who is the Senior Performance Specialist at the Altitude Centre in London. Now, I thought it'd be a really great idea to get Nick to come and have a chat with you guys just about how you can prepare for altitude before you go. So hello Nick.
Hi Keith, and hello everyone listening.
So at the Bucket List Company, we've been going a fair few years now, and people always used to say to us, like, how do I know how my body is going to react to altitude? And then we always used to say, well, you've kind of got to go and see how it reacts, really. But things have changed with science over the years, haven't they, Nick?
They have indeed, yeah. It used to be the approach of you go and see what happens. But as you said, yeah, the world has moved on a little bit since then, and there's now things people can do ahead of time to give themselves a little bit of an understanding about what is coming their way, so to speak.
So how do you get into becoming a senior performance specialist at the Altitude Centre?
Yes, it's a bit of a niche one. So I'm a graduate of Loughborough University. I did 4 years up in the Midlands, specialising in sport and exercise science. And during that course, I specialised in two main areas, which are human performance and then performance in environmental extremes. So hot, cold, zero gravity and altitude, that sort of thing. And then I was lucky enough to do a year's placement at the Altitude Centre before then coming back full-time in 2020, so in the middle of the pandemic.
And what is it then that you do at the Altitude Centre? What is your daily jobs list, if you like,
yeah.
And what you get up to?
Yeah, so there's what we do at the Altitude Centre is typically split in half. Half of what we do is sport. It's everything from you guys in your first marathon all the way up to your Mo Farahs of the world. It's everybody playing Sunday League football to the Premier League footballers. Arranged across the entire spectrum. And then the other big thing we do is mountaineering, which is where we relate to you guys at the Bucket List Company and what the listeners have got in mind potentially. And again, ranges very much along the lines of what the Bucket List Company do. We work on some low altitude climbs like Tube Carl, around 4,200 meters, all the way up to the full 8,000ers. And we've got a lot of experience working across pretty much every climb around the world now. And helping clients and athletes achieve what they want to achieve, basically.
So in terms of, if we're thinking about our listeners now then, who maybe, have done lots of trekking in the UK, they've decided that they're going to go and they want to join the 4,000 metre club, but they're not sure how their body can deal with that. What is it you can do for them?
Well, first of all, congratulations on booking your trip, because that's always the hardest bit, is clicking that button and committing to it, because there's always those nerves in the back of your mind. And you said to yourself, like, how do I cope? What do I do? And a really, really important thing I think every single climber needs to do when they line up these trips is just take a step back and just think about what the trip is, the challenges the trip is going to face. And pretty much every climb in the world splits into two elements. You've got the fitness element, taking yourself from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain and being able to walk the daily distance and climb the daily elevation you need to climb. And then the second challenge of every mountain is dealing with hypoxia or high altitude and helping and understanding, should I say, how your body is going to cope with that environment and making sure that you put yourself in the best chance of summiting, but also B, the best chance of having the best time. Because at the end of the day, and sometimes we all forget, particularly when we're on these climbs, it is a holiday and we do want to have a really good time, and you really do want to enjoy the views and enjoy the spectacle that these parts of the world offer.
Yeah, I think some people when they're on that trek might not think it's a holiday. I think they might get that on the way, when they've got back to the hotel and had a nice warm shower and a beer. But whilst they're on it, sometimes I think holiday is always a strong word to use, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes. I remember when I climbed Killy a few years ago, there was definitely parts of it that were challenging, but the more of it you can enjoy, the more special the trip feels and the more you can take away with you, so to speak. So, it's hard, but not uncompletable is almost the best way of putting it. I
mean, with the word altitude sickness gets bandied around quite a lot. And actually, I'd be interested in your sort of perspective on this, because when I describe it to people, because everyone says, I've got a headache, I've got altitude sickness. And I always say, well, no, you haven't got altitude sickness. You've got the effects of being at altitude. In terms of if you go up on a ski lift and you go from the bottom all the way to the top, you get up there, you feel a little bit dizzy, you feel a little bit out of breath. That doesn't necessarily, I always say that's not altitude sickness. That is an effect of being at altitude.
Yeah, and there is a crossover point there, and it's interesting because you mentioned effects of altitude, but then you also mentioned symptoms of altitude sickness, and there is a crossover there. So the breathlessness and the dizziness, they tend to be more what's known as acute effects or short-term effects. So if you said it yourself, I'm going low to high very, very quickly. They will give you short-term effects of altitude, the dizziness, the lightheadedness, that sort of thing, and that is an altitude sickness because when you descend, those symptoms go away. However, if somebody's experiencing a headache, that is a classified symptom of altitude sickness. And altitude sickness comes in 3 definitive stages, and it's what's known as a progressive illness. So you don't go from everything to nothing. You go through set stages that progressively get worse. So stage 1 is known as mild symptoms. So that's headache, nausea, sleep disturbance, drop in appetite, maybe a little bit of grumpiness, fatigue, that side of things, more than you would normally see. That then progresses on to moderate altitude sickness. That nausea is turned to vomiting. You've taken some paracetamol and ibuprofen, and that headache is still there. And then you're starting to get more to what's known as ataxia. So ataxia is essentially coordinational losses or change in cognitive function, something like that. And again, that's slightly towards the more top end of moderate. You then progress finally into severe AMS, which some people probably heard about when they've done their research. And essentially the 2 very well-known cases or examples of severe AMS, are HACE, high altitude cerebral edema or fluid on the brain, or HAPE, high altitude pulmonary edema, fluid on the lung. And that's where things get quite serious. Typically speaking, if you are going to start to experience those very, very severe symptoms of altitude sickness, you either are incredibly unlucky and you show you show a poor level of susceptibility or poor tolerance to altitude, or there maybe have been decisions that you've made on your trip or decisions that have been made within the group that maybe didn't suit that individual best. So it is always avoidable. And the aim of every tour operator and the aim of every guide is to not let somebody get to the stage where they are potentially suffering more serious symptoms, which is why we have the rule of when you're told to turn around, you turn around. It's for your own well-being, even if you don't realize it at that exact point.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that. So then, someone's booked a trip and they want to know how altitude is going to affect them. So they're going to go and climb Mount Toubkal. And as you then said, how susceptible you are to altitude.
Yep.
What would you do for that person if they were to come and see you in London at the altitude centre?
Yes, it's very much a case of what suits a climber best is always our approach, because we understand that not everybody comes to everything from the same approach. We fully understand that. But if somebody always asks us, like, what do you recommend? Our recommendation is no matter what you're climbing, anything 4,000 meters plus, is you start with testing. The same way if you're going to do anything new for the first time, you test yourself to see how you're going to cope. And we mentioned it earlier, like I think you said it yourself, like, earlier, previously it was a case if you go to altitude and you see what happens, that's the old school mentality. Whereas now, actually, that's not the case. There is testing that you can do to find out how well your body deals with altitude prior to a trip. So you can actually see, right, I deal with altitude really, really well. Fantastic. One less thing to worry about. Really focus on that physical training side of things and go and have a wicked trip. Equally, there are people that don't deal with altitude as well. And again, we can come up with strategies and plans to help that individual. So when they do head out to the mountain, they are well prepared, they are pre-acclimatized, and they can go and have a good trip. And again, there's a sliding spectrum within that window of people who suffer below average, above average, somewhere around the middle, and then coming up with a plan that suits that individual is how we work in a case-by-case basis, basically.
So if I was, I was coming to you, for example, and is the testing just a one session thing?
Yep. So it's a one-off testing session. They typically take anywhere from 90 minutes to 2 hours. We like to collect a lot of data on individuals. If we're going to give recommendations, we want to make sure they've got a good scientific grounding to them. And essentially, we'll take individuals up to either 5,000 or 6,000 meters in their testing, depending on kind of the climb they're doing and the constraints of that climb, both passively So seated to replicate kind of the camping, the eating, the sleeping, the resting compartment of the trip, and actively, so getting them walking and moving, again, replicating the exact challenge that's coming their way with these climbs. And we collect data on them over a couple of different physiological metrics, so we can then understand how that individual reacts at altitude, and then compare that to independent data and our own databases to help us draw our conclusions.
And how much would a session like that typically cost then?
Yeah, typically you're looking, depending on kind of the level of testing you're looking for, it's anywhere from 199 to 299. And as I said, it's a one-off session. And then from there, people can come up with a plan that suits best for them if it's needed. You know, we quite regularly see people who don't need to do any training. And then we also see people who do need to do some training. And then obviously the data leads us to our recommendations based off the back of that.
And I suppose if you're paying, you know, £3,500 to go and do a trip, actually going and spending £199 to understand how you are going to react at altitude is actually, well, money well spent.
Well, that's the way we always look at it as well. And it can answer that question. And one of the big things we always get, and it's actually really common, you know, people saying like, oh, you know, my partner or my friends are worried about me. You know, if your loved one comes and says, oh, I'm doing Kili, or I'm going to go to Everest Base Camp, you're like, are you going to be okay? Like, we can help answer and remove that question as well, because if you've got scientific data, you can then make decisions based off the data that's specific for you. And as I said, it's about helping a climber as much as possible, whether that be with actually nerves and rationalizing what's coming their way, or by actually coming up with a plan that suits that person to help as much as we can.
And one thing that, you know, I'm really interested in is when you just said then that we can pre-acclimatize people before they go. How long, or what's the maximum length you can do that before they go on the trip? Where do they lose that pre-acclimatization before they go? Yeah,
so again, it very much depends on the climb that somebody's got in mind. You know, if you come to me and say you're doing Everest, or I'm doing an 8,000, I'm off in 2 weeks, I'll be honest, that's not perfect. And that normally takes a little bit longer. Whereas if you're doing Tube Carl or Kili or Everest Base Camp, we're normally talking hours rather than weeks. And it's a case of structuring the training in a way that suits that individual best. Typically, for most individuals of an average tolerance or an average susceptibility, you're looking at somewhere between kind of 5 to 12 hours of targeted work, looking at specific areas. So what I mean by that is during the testing, we will help an individual understand their areas of strength and their areas of weaknesses, because when you're climbing, it's never going to be your strength that causes you issues. It's going to be what you're not good at. So, you know, we will find out what that is and then come up with a training methodology to target that. And then, as I said, from there, we can kind of build through it. We continuously reanalyze the data. So every session, the data gets sent to one of the sports scientists. They reanalyze the data, make sure that it was the right session for that climber. We make sure that the training is going in the direction that we want it to go in. And then if it is, we will continue. If not, we will make changes to make sure we continue the forward progression, so to speak, that we're looking for. But in terms of kind of pre-acclimatization, there's a couple of different methods that people can use. And again, it's about what suits somebody best. And that can range typically from sleeping at altitude. Some athletes that show a lot of susceptibility, you know, they may put a tent over the bed, or for athletes that are climbing very, very big climbs, that's an option we have. A second option can be known as what's known as IHE, which is intermittent hypoxic exposure, which is exposure to very, very high levels of altitude, up to 6,500 or 7,000 meters in short, sharp bouts passively. Or we have what's known as IHT, which is intermittent hypoxic training, which can be done either in a chamber or via a mask, where athletes can, again, exercise up to 6,500 meters and begin to replicate exactly the challenges that are coming their way. So a really good example is if you look at, you know, summit night for Kilimanjaro, it's pretty notorious for being quite a tough one. And essentially what we can do is replicate exactly what an individual is going to go through during a session. So what I mean by that is, you know, we can start an individual off at kind of, this is the assumption that individual is already partly pre-acclimatized. It comes with that caveat. You know, we could start them off at kind of 4,800, 4,900 meters at the start of the session. And then over the 50 or 60 minute session that we be with an individual, we gradually build them up. So by the end of the session, they can be walking up at 6,000 meters at the top of Kilimanjaro, and they'd experience exactly kind of what that journey will feel like, okay, it's shorter and it's in a controlled controlled environment, but we can help people go through that process, understand what's coming their way, and also help them build that confidence of knowing they've been there in training. So when they head out to the mountain, it's again partly pre-acclimatized to the conditions that are coming their way.
And how long then would it be? So if you did that training for Kilimanjaro like 2 weeks before you actually were on summit night, would you still be acclimatized 2 weeks later?
100%. Yeah, that's exactly how we do things. And the perfect window for acclimatization is the last 4 to 6 weeks. Anything more than 4 to 6 weeks for most moderate climbs. So we would class Kilimanjaro or Everest Base Camp as a moderate climb. You'd be looking at the last 4 to 6 weeks are the most important. And then after a decent exposure, about a decent exposure level of kind of 5 to 12 hours, you'd have anywhere between 7 to 14 days of exposure window before then the numbers would start to decline. And that is, again, assuming somebody spent the entire 7 to 14 days at sea level. So, if they went out to the mountain, an example is Everest Base Camp, they went out to Kathmandu. Kathmandu is still 1,400 meters. You then go out to Lukla, that's 2,700-ish sort of meters. So suddenly you're actually not looking at sea level, you're already at altitude, and then that window can be extended slightly. So typically though, in the perfect world, we ask people to train as close to their leaving date as possible. So it's not uncommon for us to have people to turn up for their final session with their bag on the way to the airport, put it that way.
And it can also be done at home, can't it?
Yeah, indeed. Everything that we do in our site here in London can be done at home or anywhere across Europe. Yeah, you can come to the altitude or the altitude can come to you. We have portable units that can be sent anywhere that's needed to be sent. And
what's it cost to hire one of those then?
You'd be looking at around about anywhere from kind of £480 a month, depending on the setup. And again, we have the options for sports science support at home if you'd like it. They all come with training plans and things like that and help. It's not a case of here's a machine, have fun. It's a case of we want to help climbers through that process as well. And again, we can conduct our consultations remotely as well. So for those who maybe can't make it to London but do want to train, they can have a machine delivered to the house. We can undergo the testing and then we can specialise the training off the back of that for an individual.
And one question we get asked a whole lot is obviously about the use of Diamox to aid altitude. What are your thought process on Diamox?
Yeah, okay. The first thing I have to say to make very, very clear is that I'm not a medical professional. I'm a sports scientist. I didn't go to medical school. So if you are going to take Diamox or it is something you're interested in, you need to go and speak to your GP or speak to an online doctor. They will talk you through the dosages. They will talk you through everything you need to know and make sure it's the right drug for you. In terms of kind of how we come across Diamox, it's a question we get asked very, very regularly. And the first thing I want to make clear is to here at the centre, like, it's not my place to tell you whether you should or shouldn't take anything. That's the first thing. But there are pros and cons to Diamox. The pros is that it works. There is good scientific evidence to show that Diamox does increase oxygen levels when at altitude. And again, without getting too sciencey, it's to do with blood acidity and oxygen binding. So it's proven to work. But there are drawbacks to Diamox as well. There's ethical issues around taking a drug you don't need for some people. It's a diuretic, which is a very important one. And I'm sure a message that you guys drill into people on the mountain is drink, drink, drink. Typically females should drink 4 to 6 litres a day, males 5 to 7 litres a day. If you're taking Diamox, you've got to add at least 1 litre onto that. So that's a significant increase in volume. It can give you tingly fingers and tingly toes, which again can be disconcerting. And again, particular guides you will work with in particular parts of the world may or may not want you taking Diamox, so you are going to have to check with them as well. The only 2 rules we have in terms of anybody who wants to take it is take 1 dose in the UK to make sure you're not allergic. You'd much rather find out here than over there. And B, tell your guide or make sure your guide is happy with it, because they need to be aware of what people have taken. Because if somebody has shown symptoms on Diamox, that is more serious than somebody who's shown symptoms not on Diamox.
Yeah, exactly. There are some good tips there. And in terms of if people have gone through the training with you, then would you still suggest, or not suggest, but would you still have them taking Diamox, or is there no need for it once they've been through that process with you?
That's a difficult one to say. Again, it comes down to how an individual feels on the mountain and what that individual is comfortable with. We have some people who train with us for the reason so they don't have to take Diamox. They see it as I don't want to take the drug, therefore I'm going to do lots of training. We have some people who take it with them as a precautionary measure, and some people who take it on top of the training because that's what they feel most comfortable doing. We have a wide range across all 3.
So we've been talking about, obviously, majority in terms of Everest Base Camp, Kilimanjaro, the kind of the treks that we do. We do go up Island Peak. We've got a group about to summit Island Peak tomorrow. But a lot of the work that you guys are doing now is around the 8,000 meter peaks as well. Like, just talk us through the process of an 8,000 meter peak and what you do to aid climbers achieving their dreams of 8,000 meters.
Yeah, that's exactly it. As I said, like the most common climbs we work on are Kili, Base Camp 2, Carl, the climbs that the majority of these listeners will be doing. But yeah, we get a couple every month who are maybe a screw loose, if that's the right way to call them, who do fancy standing on top of the world. And it's a challenging process. It's a journey of a lifetime. And the first thing we always ask somebody is what style of trip are you doing? Now that might sound unfamiliar to some, but the world of mountaineering has changed an awful lot in the last 5 years. Everest is a prime example. The typical Everest expedition used to be 50 days. However, in the modern world, we now have flash expeditions where people can climb Everest in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We had somebody climb an 8,000er in just over a week last month. So the first thing we distinguish is what type of climb they're doing. And then after that, it's very much a case, again, exactly the same process you would go through with any other climb. You test, you train, you monitor, you progress, you test, you train, you monitor, you progress, and you gradually build somebody up and up and up to the highest heights that we can work to and the highest heights that any commercial machine can go to, which is 6,500 meters, or Camp 1 on most 8,000 meter peaks. They would then go out to do their 8,000 meter peak and join in rotations as everybody else would. So there's no way to acclimatize for anybody over 6,500 meters. There is no machine that does it. And to be brutally honest, it's nearly a waste of time because you can't pre-acclimatize for that height. There's a reason people don't live that high. It's just not sustainable for human life. But what we do is we get them ready for the highest height we can get them ready for, 6,500 meters, and then allow them just to join in the rotations. And when they start that rotations, and for those not familiar of the connotation of a rotation, I should say that is when you go from base camp to Camp 1, back down, 1, 2, back down, 1, 2, 3, and back down, and then up to Camp 3, rest, 4, summit, and come back down. So you don't go from everything to nothing. You progressively get higher. The athletes that we work with will then either fly in very late into a trip and start on rotation straight away, or if they're doing a traditional trip, they can start rotations earlier and have a reduced workload. So when it does come to their summit push, they're not as fatigued and they're better acclimatized.
Yeah, that's super important, I think. And in terms of your data then of the success rates of people that you work with, what data have you got on that?
So this year we've had a very successful 8,000 meter season this year. We've had 38 of 38 summits, which is a new record for us, which we're really, really happy with. But in terms of kind of the climbs that we're talking about here, our success rate on Kili is well into the 90%. It's the same on Everest Base Camp. And, we still have clients that have worked with us who haven't made it. There's no shying away from that. Some of them have been due to mistakes they've made on the mountain. Some of them have been due to illness or injury, and I'll be honest, some of them have been due to altitude sickness. There's no straying away from that. There is no surefire way to deal with it, and we are not given that guarantee at all. That comes to the caveat: the athletes that we have had, or climbers we have had, who have struggled with altitude, the majority of them haven't always followed the recommendations that we've given. They've done something, but maybe not what we recommended. But yeah, we have a pretty good success rate across nearly all mountains across the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I think from what have we done this year? 6, 7 Kili climbs, I think, this year. And I think we've had a 97% success rate this year on Kili. And I think the reason for that is all of our groups are guided by our brilliant Tanzanian guides who just know the mountain so well and look after our guests really well. But they're also accompanied by a UK guide who, I always say we're probably more aware of the issues than maybe some of the Tanzanian guides in terms of medical, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just thinking that actually, although we've got a success rate of 97%, people have struggled. They have really had a hard time to get there and do it. It's great that they've done it, but I think the important thing there is like you were saying, more so is the enjoyment that they would then get if they were already acclimatized at that point to get there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I'm assuming, do you do a 6 or you do a 7-day route on Kili, don't you?
We do a 6 on the Marangu, and then we do the longer Lemosho as well. So
yeah, exactly. Whereas, again, included in our numbers is those who do 1, 2 or 3 day summits. So we do have people who do exceptionally fast climbs. Yeah. And again, our success rate for those is still into the 90%, which is significantly above the mountain. For those doing the longer routes, for those who are incredibly susceptible, those unlucky 3% who maybe didn't make it, it's about weeding those out and doing something about it. And for those who made it, but let's be honest, maybe didn't have the most enjoyable experience, it's about making it as fun as possible. You know, when you stand on the top of the roof of Africa, you stand at Everest Base Camp, you don't have a banging headache, you're not feeling sick, and you can really take in the magic and the wonder of where you are, and also appreciate, all the hard work and commitment that's gone into that climb, because, these are once in a lifetime trips. You commit a lot in terms of time, effort, and emotion into these, and enjoying every second is definitely part of the journey.
Yeah, no, completely. So, I mean, thanks ever so much, Nick, for coming on and talking us through that process. It's super interesting, and I would be really interested to come up and actually put myself through it and see how
100%. See what you're made of.
Yeah. Maybe we won't publish the data to all of our clients, but it depends how good the data is, I suppose.
I was about to say, I'm open to bribes. It's absolutely fine.
Yeah. But where can people find out more about the Altitude Centre, get involved, come and get tested? Like, what are people's options, and how can they get on with it?
The best place is to head to our website. So it's thealtitudecentre.com. All the information is on there, and there's a fantastic tab under mountaineering. We try and make it as easy as possible for people because, there's a lot of data out there, and there's a lot of things that we do for different people. So head over there, have a look at that tab. And then there's live chat function on the website. We've got a phone number. We're mostly friendly. So any questions, just ask, because we appreciate what we do is very niche and we want to help. And the biggest thing is making sure that whatever plan we come up with suits that person. So if people want to have a chat, want to come and learn a little bit more, just give us a call and ask away. And we're more than happy to run people through the different plans and make sure that whatever plan we come up with is the one that works best for them.
And you're pretty central in central London. It's easy to get to you.
Yeah, we're based in Aldgate at the moment, so right in the heart of the city. And then that's where we are at the moment. So
brilliant. Well, Nick, thanks ever so much for coming on today and talking us through that. Like I said, I'm super interested in it, and we always, one thing we do with all of our groups is do oxygen saturation every day and record the groups. And, data is something that I'm super interested in seeing how people cope with it. So it's something that I definitely am going to get involved with. So thanks for coming on and explaining that. Guys, if you are interested, you're thinking about doing a trip, if you don't know how you're going to cope, then before you even book your trip, it might be worthwhile going up and seeing these guys just to get that peace of mind before you click the buy it now button, just to know that, your body can cope with that. So, but if you've got any questions, ring them up, speak to Nick and get in touch with them. So thanks ever so much for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Please rate and review and keep going and keep traveling. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.